You've been stuck inside for 3 days because of rain, and you're already losing your mind. You've got a roof over your head. You've got heating. You've got a fridge full of food and a phone full of things to scroll through. And somehow you're still restless, still irritated, still counting the hours until the sky clears. Now take all that away. Take away the roof. Take away the walls. Take away the dry socks, the electric kettle, the waterproof jacket hanging by the door. Put yourself in a forest in prehistoric Europe, 60,000 years ago, in the middle of a rainy season that just doesn't stop. The temperature is hovering somewhere just above the point where it would kill you. Every single thing you need to stay alive, fire, food, warmth, gets harder to reach with every hour the rain keeps falling. And this isn't a hypothetical. This was Tuesday. This was every week for months at a time. This was the actual texture of being human, for most of the time humans have existed. Here's the thing nobody really stops to think about when they picture ancient life. We love the dramatic stuff. Saber-toothed cats, migrations across continents, tribal warfare. Hollywood loves it too. But rain isn't dramatic. Rain is boring and slow and relentless, and it was probably more dangerous to early humans than almost anything with teeth ever was. It put out fires that took hours to build. It caused hypothermia in temperatures that don't even sound cold. It rotted stored food. It flooded shelters in the middle of the night. And it didn't last an afternoon. It lasted for weeks, sometimes months, and somehow, without any of it being written down anywhere. Ancient humans didn't just survive that. They figured out how to live inside it, generation after generation, in some of the wettest, most miserable climates on the planet. So, how did they do it? Let's actually walk through it. Start with the part almost nobody thinks about first. It's not drowning. It's not flooding. The real killer, the quiet one, is heat loss. Water pulls heat away from your body roughly 25 times faster than air does. Sit with that number for a second, because it's not a small difference. It's the difference between sitting in a chilly room and feeling a bit uncomfortable versus sitting in cold water and slowly dying without even realizing how close you are to the edge. When you're wet, your body is losing heat faster than your metabolism can replace it, especially if there's any wind at all. And this is exactly why hypothermia is such an efficient killer in wet conditions, even when the air temperature isn't close to freezing. You don't need snow. You don't need ice. You need wet clothes, a light breeze, and a temperature around 10 degrees Celsius. That's a rainy British afternoon. That's a spring night almost anywhere in Central Europe. That was, for early humans, just an ordinary Tuesday in dozens of environments they call home. They knew this. Not from a textbook, not from a weather app, but from watching people around them die from it. And that meant the single most important survival skill in wet conditions wasn't hunting, and it wasn't finding shelter. It was managing your own body temperature before it managed you. Let's talk about fire, because fire is the obvious answer here, and also, weirdly, the most complicated one. Fire and rain hate each other. Wet wood doesn't light. Wet tinder doesn't catch. A fire that takes a direct hit of rain simply dies. And when you're already cold and wet, a dead fire isn't an inconvenience. It's a death sentence written in soggy ash. So how did ancient humans keep a fire alive through a storm that lasted for days? Here's where it gets interesting. They didn't think about fire the way we think about lighting a match. They thought about it the way we think about electricity, as infrastructure, not something you create on demand, but something you maintain continuously. Because starting a fire from nothing in the rain, with bare hands and no lighter, is one of the hardest physical tasks a human being can attempt. So instead, they carried it across cultures that have never had any contact with each other. You find the same solution independently invented. Embers wrapped in slow-burning material, damp moss, certain types of fungus, particular bark, could smolder for hours while a group traveled. Inuit groups carried smoldering material in sealed containers. Indigenous communities in Australia used specific slow burning wood to move fire across huge distances. Archaeological sites in Europe show hearths that appear to burn, in some form, continuously for years, not relit from scratch over and over, but tended, federal protected, treated less like a tool and more like a living thing that needed someone watching over it. And that need created something we don't usually think about when we picture ancient life. It created a job. In bad weather, someone's role wasn't a hunt, and it wasn't to forage. It was to sit with the fire, to shield it from wind and rain, to feed it exactly enough, at exactly the right pace, so the group didn't wake up in the dark, cold, and starting from nothing. This is one of the earliest divisions of labor we can actually see evidence for. Long before anyone specialized in tool-making or hunting or healing, someone in the group specialized in fire. But fire needs cover survive real rain, which brings us to the second piece of this puzzle, and it's one that completely overturns the image most of us grew up with. Most people picture ancient humans as cave dwellers, huddled somewhere dark and damp, waiting out the weather. That image is mostly an accident of what happened to survive in the archaeological record. Caves preserve evidence, well, so caves are where we look, and because that's where we look, that's what we assume. But caves are actually rare. They're often already occupied by predators who'd very much like you to leave. They're frequently cold, damp, and limited to specific geography that most groups didn't have access to. Most ancient humans lived in structures they built themselves, and even the earliest of those structures show a level of environmental problem solving that's honestly kind of humbling. The oldest known constructed shelters date back around 400,000 years, long before anatomically modern humans even existed. They weren't fancy, but they were deliberate. Branches angled specifically to shed. Water, leaves layered in overlapping rows, each one covering the seam below it. So rain ran off the surface instead of soaking through. That's the exact same principle behind a modern roof, arrived at independently, with no formal education, by a species whose brain was noticeably smaller than yours. By the time modern humans were spreading out across the globe, their temporary shelters had gotten remarkably advanced for materials available. Structures made from mammoth bone, found in Eastern Europe and dated to around 15,000 years ago, show real architectural thinking. Heavy bones anchored into the ground specifically to resist wind. Hides stretched tightly across the frame. Evidence of insulation layers built in on the inside. These weren't holes people crawled into the hide. They were engineered environments, purpose-built to hold heat in and keep moisture out. And that hide construction is worth slowing down on because it represents one of the most important material breakthroughs in human history. And it happened specifically because people were trying to solve the rain problem. Properly prepared animal hide is nearly waterproof. The natural fat content gives it water resistance on its own. But when ancient humans started scraping, stretching, treating hide with fat or brain tissue, then smoking them, they were essentially inventing leather from scratch. And leather is remarkable stuff. Flexible, durable, warm when dry, far more water resistant than anything woven from plant fiber. Think about the mental leap required to get there. You have to look at a dead animal's skin and think, that could become something that protects my skin weeks from now in a completely different situation. That's not instinct. That's planning across a delayed timeline. The animal is killed today. The hide is processed over several days. The finished product keeps you dry in a storm that hasn't happened yet. That is abstract thinking of a genuinely high order. And there's evidence of hide scraping tools in Africa dating back at least 120,000 years, possibly earlier. Rain didn't just threaten ancient humans. In a very real sense, it made them smarter because staying dry was worth solving hard problems for. Now, let's talk about something that almost never comes up in these conversations. Reading the landscape itself. Most of us today experience weather as something that just happens to us. We check an app. We get caught in the rain anyway. We go inside and complain about it. We've outsourced our weather awareness completely. And in doing that, we've lost a skill that used to be second nature. Ancient humans didn't have that option. Survival meant reading the environment constantly, catching the signs before the storm actually arrived. The smell of rain before it comes is a real, measurable chemical signal. So is the way animals behave hours before a storm hits. Birds fly lower. Insects swarm differently. Certain animals start moving toward higher ground on their own. The shape and color of clouds. The way wind shifts direction. The texture of the surface of open water. All of it carries real information, and ancient humans read it fluently, automatically, the way you read a stop sign without consciously thinking about it, because their lives depended on getting it right. That meant decisions about shelter and movement were often made hours before rain actually arrived. You don't get caught out in a downpour when you've been reading the sky all day and you've still got 3 hours of daylight left to find high ground and get a cover built. This kind of environmental fluency is so deeply embedded in traditional communities that researchers studying them today describe it as almost supernatural, even though it isn't supernatural at all. It's expertise. The specific kind of expertise that develops when weather literacy is a line between living and not, practiced every single day, refined across generations, and taught deliberately to the next one. We used to have this. We traded it for a weather app on our phone, and honestly, something real was lost in that trade. There's a piece of this that goes even deeper than reading the sky, and it's a geography of where ancient humans actually chose to sleep. Elevation matters enormously in wet conditions, and this is something most people never think about. Cold air sinks, wet air pools in low ground. On a rainy night, the difference between camping on a slight rise and camping in a shallow dip of land can be the difference between waking up a little damp and waking up sitting in several inches of freezing water. Ancient humans understood this the same way a plumber today understands that water runs downhill through direct, repeated, sometimes painful observation. South-facing slopes in the northern hemisphere catch more sun and dry out faster after rain. Dense broadleaf canopy can intercept a huge percentage of light to moderate rainfall before it ever reaches the ground, and people camped underneath it on purpose. Certain rock formations create natural overhangs that show up as shelter sites across almost every inhabited continent. Not because people couldn't build their own, but because a natural overhang is a head start that saves hours of construction time when a storm is already rolling in. And this knowledge, which specific spots in a given landscape actually kept you dry, wasn't reinvented every generation. It was accumulated, passed down. Groups returned to the same good shelter locations year after year, the same way they returned to the same hunting grounds. You can see this in the archaeological record itself. Sites with layers of ash and bone and tools stacked on top of each other across thousands of years, because the spot was good, and everyone who came before made sure the people who came after knew it too. Landscape knowledge and rain survival weren't two separate things. They were the same thing. Now, here's a part that surprised even researchers when they started digging into it properly. Ancient humans may have had physiological advantages in cold, wet conditions that most of us have simply lost through modern comfort. Take the cold shock response. You fall into cold water, and your body goes through an immediate, involuntary cascade. Sharp inhale, rapid breathing, sudden cardiovascular stress. This is largely automatic, and it's responsible for a surprising number of cold water deaths, including among strong swimmers who simply weren't prepared for the shock of it. But here's what's interesting. That response is partly learned. People who are regularly exposed to cold showers, cold swimming, consistent cold weather, show a measurably reduced cold shock response over time. Their bodies adapt. Ancient humans were cold, wet, and exposed to constant temperature swings in a way that literally no modern person living in a climate-controlled home can approximate. Their baseline physiological response to cold wasn't something they were born with in isolation. It was calibrated continuously by an environment that never gave them the option of turning up a thermostat. They weren't tougher because they were a different kind of human. They were tougher because they were trained by conditions we've mostly engineered out of our lives. There's also real evidence around fat distribution and metabolic adaptation. Populations that lived in cold, wet climates for generations show metabolic profiles that differ from people in climate-controlled environments today. Higher resting metabolic rates when it's cold. More efficient heat generation from a specific type of fat that produces heat directly instead of just storing energy. Some of this is genetic, built up through generations of selection pressure in harsh climates. The Inuit are the most studied example of this, a population shaped over thousands of years by some of the coldest, wettest conditions people have ever chosen to live in. But part of this adaptation isn't purely genetic. It's maintained by ongoing exposure, and researchers have found that any human regularly exposed to cold, regardless of ancestry, starts to show some version of it. The body responds to what it's actually asked to handle. It always has. Ancient humans in wet, cold climates weren't surviving despite their bodies. They were surviving with bodies that had been shaped over a lifetime and over generations, specifically for those exact conditions. Which brings us to something genuinely underrated in how we talk about ancient survival, the social side of it. Surviving rain alone is brutal. Surviving it as a group is a completely different situation. Shared body heat is a real, measurable survival mechanism. A cluster of people huddled together under a rain-covered generates and holds heat collectively in a way that no individual can replicate alone. The person on the outer edge of the group is noticeably colder than the person in the middle, and ancient humans understood that trade-off intuitively. Sleeping arrangements in cold, wet conditions were communal and dense, and nobody thought twice about it. Privacy, it turns out, is a warm weather luxury. The fire-keeping role we talked about earlier was part of a bigger system, a whole structure of weather-related labor that shows up again and again across cultures anthropologists have studied. Younger, physically stronger group members handled gathering and maintenance. Older members, carrying more accumulated experience, made the calls on when to move and where to shelter. Children were kept at the center, physically surrounded and protected by the bodies around them. The group wasn't just a social unit in bad weather. It functioned as a shared heat regulation system. And this is exactly why the popular image of the lone caveman surviving alone against nature is mostly fiction. A trained individual can survive short bursts of genuinely hostile weather alone. But across weeks, across a full rainy season, humans survive as groups, full stop. And knowledge moved through those groups constantly. The fire-carrying technique, the hide waterproofing process, how to read pre-storm animal behavior, which specific trees had bark that burned slow enough to transport embers across distance. None of this got reinvented from scratch by every new generation. It was taught directly through instruction, observation, and repeated practice. The accumulated survival knowledge a group carried was arguably its single most valuable possession, more valuable than any individual tool. When a group lost its elders to illness or violence, it didn't just lose people. It lost institutional memory that couldn't be rebuilt quickly, and that's very likely one of the reasons care for older, non-reproductive individuals shows up surprisingly early in the archaeological record. Looking after someone who could no longer hunt or build wasn't sentimental generosity. It was a rational protection of the group's accumulated survival knowledge, walking around in a human being. Now, let's talk about food, because rain doesn't pause your hunger, and sustained wet weather creates its own very specific set of problems. Animals shelter and become harder to track. Foods are normally reliable. Seeds, dried berries, roots you'd normally dig up, get waterlogged, buried under mud, or simply inaccessible for days at a stretch. And on top of all of that, the cold itself is burning through your calories faster than usual. That combination, less available food and higher energy demand, is a genuinely dangerous squeeze, and a group that hadn't prepared for it wouldn't last long. Ancient humans handled this a few different ways. First, through deliberate food storage. There's evidence of this deep in the prehistoric record. Caches of nuts, dried meat, preserved fish, buried in cool locations or stored up off the ground to stay away from moisture. That's not instinct. That's foresight. That's a group recognizing that the season is going to change, that food available today might not be there tomorrow, and building a bridge across that gap ahead of time instead of hoping for the best. Second, they shifted what they were eating based on exactly what the rain itself produced. Earthworms surface in huge numbers after heavy rain. Freshwater fish move predictably during flooding. Certain mushrooms and fungi fruit heavily in wet conditions. Snails, insects, frogs, all of it becomes more available in wet weather because those creatures are responding to the same moisture. Ancient humans, who were always paying attention, adjusted the menu accordingly. Flexibility wasn't a personality trait here. It was a survival requirement. And third, maybe most importantly, groups shared food equitably through the lean stretches. Hoarding individually during a real survival situation actually weakens the group's collective resilience. A well-fed person surrounded by a starving group isn't a survivor. They're just a casualty on a delay, waiting for everyone around them to fall apart first, taking the whole structure down with them. The sharing norms you find in essentially every hunter-gatherer society studied by anthropologists exist, at least in part, because cooperating through difficult, wet, lean seasons is what actually kept people alive long enough to see the next one. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture, because it tells you something genuinely surprising about how ancient humans related to wet weather in the first place. Most modern people, given a free choice, gravitate toward moderate climates. Not too hot, not too cold, not too wet. You can see it in population density maps today. Temperate. Stable regions consistently attract and hold more people. Ancient humans didn't have that luxury, and honestly, they didn't always seem to want it. They went into monsoon-soaked Southeast Asia, into the permanently damp temperate rainforests along coastal Europe, into river delta systems that flooded on predictable, violent seasonal cycle, into subarctic regions where the ground stayed wet or frozen for most of the year. They didn't go to these places despite the rain. In a lot of cases, they went because of what the rain actually brought with it. Wet environments are rich environments. Rivers and lakes fed by heavy rainfall are full of fish. Wet forests are full of plants, fungi, and animals that depend entirely on that moisture to exist. The exact same rain that made daily life difficult also made the food supply abundant. Ancient humans made a calculation, probably not a conscious one, more something that emerged over generations through where populations drifted and settled, that the difficulty of surviving wet conditions was worth the richness those conditions produced. And that's a fundamentally different relationship with weather than the one most of us carry around today. We treat rain as an interruption, something that cancels plans and ruins an afternoon. Ancient humans treated it as a condition, something that required skill, created real opportunity, demanded constant attention, but wasn't experienced as some alien threat sitting outside their world. It was simply part of the world they belonged to. They weren't fighting it from the outside. They were inside it, working with it all the time. Think about everything that had to come together for that to work. The waterproof hide stretched tight over a frame. The glowing ember carried for hours wrapped in damp moss. The branches angled just right, layered like shingles to shed water instead of letting it through. A whole group huddled around a fire inside a shelter. Someone spent 3 hours building because they read the sky correctly that morning and knew the weather was turning. The south-facing slope chosen on purpose because it drains faster after a storm. The food cache buried weeks earlier for exactly a week like this one. None of that is luck. All of it points to the same conclusion. Ancient humans didn't just survive the rain. They built an entire, quiet civilization of technique, accumulated knowledge, and tightly bonded social structures specifically to manage it, season after season, generation after generation, without a single word of it ever being written down. We have waterproof jackets now. We have insulated walls, central heating, weather radar, and drainage systems that move rainwater away from our buildings before we've even noticed it started falling. But every single piece of that technology is downstream of somebody, a very long time ago, sitting through a cold, wet, miserable night and figuring out that water runs downhill, that smoke keeps the inside of shelter dry, that certain animal fats can make leather almost waterproof, and that staying close to other warm bodies really is the difference between making it to morning and not. They figured all of that out first, with none of the tools we take completely for granted today. Just time, attention, knowledge passed carefully from one person to the next, and a stubborn, almost bodily refusal to just lie down and let the weather win. That's not primitive survival. Honestly, when you actually look at it closely, that's the foundation everything else we've built since was standing on. If this gave you a new way of looking at something you'd never really thought twice about, that's exactly what this channel is here for. Hit like if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want more of this, and share it with someone who'd find it just as fascinating as you did.